Now, before the Obi-Wan Kenobi series came out, I made a video that basically went through any and all lines, mainly from A New Hope, that had anything to do with Kenobi and Vader and a potential rematch of the century taking place or not taking place between them, set during the time period the show was set to take place during, which was essentially right in the middle of the 19-year gap between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. And though, yes, there were certainly a few things that already didn't make a whole lot of sense after the prequel trilogy and others that you could say were open to interpretation or elaboration, for the most part, especially when just looking at it in the context of the original trilogy or what George Lucas was trying to imply, it did seem as if the two had not met or had any type of confrontation since whatever initial event had separated them, which we of course know was their big fight on Mustafar. And so let's now, here after the Obi-Wan Kenobi series is over, once again revisit some of those lines to see if they make more or less sense now, or if they're maybe unaffected. And as usual, I'll try to be as fair as I can be, despite obviously having my own opinions about the series. Not to mention, this is all done in good fun, and you are free to disagree with my assessments in the comments below. Okay, so let's start off with what Obi-Wan tells Luke in A New Hope about how his father died. Keeping in mind that, at the time of making that film, George Lucas hadn't figured out the whole backstory for everyone and everything quite yet, that he hadn't even decided that Vader would be Luke's father, which is why when Kenobi said this, or described him in this way after Luke asked about how his father died,
"A young Jedi named Darth Vader, who was a pupil of mine until he turned to evil."
he basically meant that Darth Vader was his actual name, not some type of Sith title or anything like that. Hence, this is also why Obi-Wan called him Darth later when they encountered each other in that film.
"Only a master of evil, Darth."
And this is also why in the Kenobi series, Obi-Wan once again refers to him at essentially the end of their duel as Darth in almost this dejected or disgusted or mocking and insulting way. It's basically done as a callback and elaboration of that line in A New Hope, or to have it make more sense, which yeah, it now does. I'd say that does a pretty good job of enhancing or making sense of that line in A New Hope. And at this point you might want to ask, after realizing even Lucas didn't have all this figured out and changed things along the way, why can't they, Lucasfilm under Disney now, go back and essentially do the same thing? Why can't they go back and add new context to all those lines or even completely recontextualize them? And well, as owners of the property, they certainly can do that. They can do whatever they want with it in theory. But I'd argue the difference here is when George Lucas made A New Hope, he had no way of knowing the success it would be, no way of knowing he'd be able to make more films, much less how huge Star Wars would become one day. Plus, not only was the story still young and, shall we say, more malleable at that point, not only did very little lore or story exist, but Lucas did try to explain his inconsistencies in A New Hope by having Kenobi tell Luke in Return of the Jedi that everything he had told him earlier was true from a certain point of view. However, Disney, or Lucasfilm under Disney, they obviously not only know the success of Star Wars and have a built-in fan base, they don't have to worry so much about creating a single encapsulated story and selling it to people who don't know the first thing about the franchise like Lucas did, but they actually have the opposite problem. They have a ton of lore and a greater story to hold to that, again, fans know. They're not making it all up as they go with this series, they're instead working between two very fixed and established points, those being the two trilogies from Lucas, not to mention the Clone Wars animated series, which also adds a lot of depth to the Anakin-Obi-Wan relationship. And so anyway, getting back to what Obi-Wan says to Luke in A New Hope, we move on to this line.
"He betrayed and murdered your father."
And while this line, again, you can certainly say or argue does make more sense now, which is because in the series, Vader does tell Obi-Wan that Vader, is the one who killed Anakin Skywalker, that he, Luke's father, essentially does not exist anymore. And so, though again it is from a certain point of view, you could understand how or why Obi-Wan, who doesn't want to tell Luke the full truth just yet, why he would say that Vader betrayed and murdered Luke's father after what he learns about him in the Kenobi series. We then move on, or maybe I should say a little bit back in A New Hope, to this line when Luke and Obi-Wan first encounter each other.
"Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan. Now that's a name I've not heard in a long time. A long time."
And, well, this one is hard to rectify with the Kenobi series, considering he's called Obi-Wan Kenobi multiple times and by multiple characters in the series. And yes, he could, I guess, mean he hasn't heard that name in the last 9 years or so since the events of the series. But if we're being honest here, the reaction he has seems to be coming from someone who hasn't heard his name in much longer than that. Next, we have this one after the Millennium Falcon is pulled into one of the Death Star's hangar bays.
I sense something, a presence I've not felt since...
And this one is so vague it could mean almost anything. It could mean a presence he hasn't felt since Mustafar, a presence he hasn't felt since their encounter in the Kenobi series, or heck, a presence he hasn't felt since yesterday when Vader reached out through the Force and for some reason or somehow felt a trace of his former master out there still. Though all that said, I do think the scene or the line is implying it's been quite some time since Vader felt the presence of Kenobi, of his former master. And it's interesting to point out that had the Kenobi series wanted to go a completely different route, this one line could have been the key. They could have used it to very easily justify some type of encounter between the two through the Force, some type of shared vision where you can still have a big, elaborate lightsaber battle, not to mention some really good lines between the two characters. Next up, and before we get to some of the really big ones or important ones, we do have Tarkin saying this to Vader.
Surely he must be dead by now.
Don't underestimate the Force.
And this one is kind of interesting because it does obviously imply that Tarkin thinks there's a really good chance that Kenobi should be dead at this point, which is an odd assumption for him to make if he showed up back on the Empire's radar roughly 9 years prior to this, which he of course did when he saved Leia. However, the easy way around this one is that Tarkin simply didn't know or hear about Kenobi's return and multiple rescues of Leia, that he just wasn't privy to that information despite his rank or place in the Empire, which is possible for sure, though one might think that Tarkin, being a pretty clever guy who keeps himself in the know, would have heard about it some way somehow anyway, and thus, considering he would know Kenobi had shown up before, he wouldn't think him to be dead at this point. Okay, and now let's get to the really big one, the line or lines that pretty much everyone always brings up or discusses in relation to this.
I've been waiting for you, Obi-Wan. We meet again at last. The circle is now complete. When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master.
And as kind of talked about before, this line didn't make a whole lot of sense after the prequels already, because Anakin was, as we know, a fully fledged Jedi Knight when he turned to the dark side. However, he wasn't a Jedi Master because the Council rejected his promotion to one after being assigned to the Council by Palpatine. You've seen Revenge of the Sith, I'm sure. And so I've always kind of liked the idea, or I've liked it since the prequels, that this is what Vader was referring to. He's kind of reminding Obi-Wan that the Council didn't seem to trust him and wouldn't make him a master, that it's part of the reason why they find themselves in this situation now, and thus the circle is complete. Another theory some have about this line, or had, is that Vader is simply saying the last time they fought each other, he was a learner of the dark side, that he's not referring to being a Jedi learner or apprentice or Padawan or whatever, and that he's now a full-on master of the dark side, or that he's mastered it, since technically Palpatine is the Sith Master. Anakin still hasn't attained the rank of Master. Which, yeah, that could also make sense, but now after the Kenobi series, this line seems to be referring to the training sequence we see in the 5th episode when Obi-Wan tells Anakin that he is a great warrior, but that he has this need to prove himself and that it is his undoing, and that until he overcomes it, a Padawan you will still be. And this does seem to explain those lines in A New Hope, the learner part of it anyway, that Vader is telling him that he's finally overcome the need to prove himself, which is why he lost to the previous encounter, the one we see in the Kenobi series now. And this would actually make quite a bit of sense if it wasn't for the "when I left you" part. Because Vader does not leave Obi-Wan Kenobi, not even close, the last time they met. It is Obi-Wan that leaves Vader when he had the chance to, well, he had the chance to kill him. And yes, we of course know Obi-Wan could not kill Vader, that he'd have to ask Luke to do it years later, and would become quite distraught when Luke said that he refused to kill his father, even claiming the Emperor wins because of this, or Obi-Wan even claims the Emperor will win because Luke will not kill his father, even though Obi-Wan had the chance to do the same thing years earlier.
I can't kill my own father.
Then the Emperor has already won. You were our only hope.
And this all makes one ask, why does Obi-Wan expect Luke to kill Vader at this point in Return of the Jedi, when he could have easily killed him back then, back in the Kenobi series? And this in itself could be quite a long and interesting debate, no doubt. Is it that it's not the Jedi way to kill Vader here? Is that it? Is it that the Force is used for knowledge and defense, never attack or never killing someone for any reason? Doesn't this all sort of maybe mirror Anakin's choice in Revenge of the Sith when he decided to behead Dooku, as well as Mace Windu's choice when he tried to kill an unarmed Palpatine but was then unarmed by Anakin before being presumably killed by Palpatine after being pushed out a window? And doesn't this also sort of mirror Luke's choice not to kill Vader later in Return of the Jedi, and thanks to that decision, Vader then went on to kill Palpatine, which means, in a very roundabout way, Obi-Wan's decision not to kill Vader here, or in the Kenobi series, led to Luke being able to make the decision that would kill Palpatine later on. Aren't we being shown that when we look at all such moments where a Jedi had the chance to kill an unarmed Sith, that it always goes bad when they strike, but works out in the end when they don't? And well, you could make that argument, and I do think it's what the creators of the series were going for with Kenobi letting Vader live, that in the end, in the long term, it did work out. The galaxy will be liberated from the Sith because Kenobi makes the choice to let Vader live here. But short term, and keeping in mind Obi-Wan had no way of knowing one day Luke would face Vader and let him live, and that he'd turn on Palpatine and all of these things, nor does he know that Anakin once beheaded an unarmed or unhanded Dooku, or that Windu tried to kill Palpatine when he was too weak to defend himself. In other words, Kenobi has no way of knowing how bad things can go when you strike out against a Sith, unless you count him once killing Maul, only to have him come back, and then he kills him again, and that time, yeah, it does work out pretty well, or so we can assume so far. But anyway, you would think the conclusion that Obi-Wan comes to here, or in the Kenobi series again, is that Vader has done a great many horrible things since he left him to die on Mustafar, and will continue to do horrible things should he let him live here. It's not like, in defense of leaving him on Mustafar, that he thinks he'll simply die here on this planet. Vader's Star Destroyer is in orbit above the planet in this case, and Kenobi all but knows that. Kenobi also doesn't offer Vader the chance to surrender or to yield, which we know Vader is very, very unlikely to do. Heck, going back to that training sequence in the 5th episode again, he tells us, or it tells us, that Vader is not going to relent no matter what. He's not going to give up a fight and surrender. He has to win and prove himself at all cost. We also know, or Kenobi just learned, that Anakin is truly gone. His brother is dead and gone. That Vader literally tells him as much, and there's no reason for Kenobi to believe otherwise at this point. And so, in all reality, Kenobi should have actually and finally done what he must. He should have killed Darth Vader right there. And killing him, yes, would have been the Jedi way and would have been done in defense, as in defense of the countless innocent lives Darth Vader would no doubt take. In many ways, you can argue all the atrocities Vader commits after this moment, after Kenobi lets him live, that it's all on Obi-Wan's hands. But anyway, like I said, this could certainly be debated more, and maybe I'll do a full video on this one or put up a poll asking what you all think. But for now, let's move on to the last clip or line. This one from Return of the Jedi after Luke asks his father to come with him.
Come with me.
Obi-Wan once thought as you do.
And a lot of people seem to think this implies there must have been a time when Obi-Wan pleaded with Vader to turn away from the dark side like Luke is doing now. But I've always thought it's more or less just a general statement made by Vader, that since he believes that Luke was trained by Obi-Wan and Obi-Wan alone, not knowing anything about Yoda, he's saying, you sound like our former master. You sound like exactly how Obi-Wan once sounded. Not that Vader is referring to a specific time after becoming Vader, where Obi-Wan pleaded with him to turn back from the dark side. And indeed, in the series, Obi-Wan never really does anything of the sort. He apologizes to Anakin, but he never tries to turn him back to the light. He never tries to appeal to his better nature. And so depending on how you view that line in Return of the Jedi, as either Vader making a general statement about the one who he thinks trained both of them, or you think it refers to a time Obi-Wan tried to bring him back to the light, well, that'll determine whether you think this line is good or contradicted or not. In closing here, I think it's very apparent that the series, or those making it I should say, they were very aware of all the lines, or most of the lines from A New Hope, and what a rematch of the century could do to them. And in all reality, again being as fair as possible here, they did a decent job of making sense of most of them, or not contradicting most of them, or recontextualizing them in a way that does or could basically work. Problem is, they didn't seem to ask if they should, they only asked if they could, and they only work all the way up to the bitter end of it too, up until the point where Kenobi simply leaves Vader, which not only doesn't fit with Vader saying, "when I left you," but doesn't seem to be what Kenobi would actually do in that situation, that he would, after failing to kill Vader once upon a time, finally do what he must here and put an end to him once and for all. I mean, he even says before the fight it's either him or me, and turns out it wasn't either one of them. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think of the Kenobi series and how it handled all of those lines from A New Hope and some from Return of the Jedi as well. Does it all fit very neatly in your opinion, or have they created a giant mess? Whatever you think, leave your comments below. Let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.